Right, in this video we're going to go back to experiments and we're going to look in a little bit more detail at the different types of experiments that psychologists use during their investigations. So there are four main types of experiment that psychologists would use. The lab experiment is probably the one people think of when you say the word experiment, but we've also got field experiments, natural experiments and quasi experiments. So we're just going to go through each of them in turn. A lab experiment then. So the key feature of a lab experiment is that it's conducted in a controlled environment. Now, a controlled environment doesn't have to mean the sort of lab that you see in this picture here. It could just be a room. A psychology lab is very often just a room, maybe with computers in, something like that. And a lab or a controlled environment just means that you can control extraneous variables. So tasks in these sorts of experiments are often very artificial. A lot of the studies that we've looked at so far in memory were lab experiments. So the sort of tasks participants were asked to do were things like remembering word lists. These are not things that we do generally in everyday life. Maybe a shopping list occasionally, but just learning lists of meaningful words isn't reflective of tasks that we would carry out normally. And therefore, it could be argued that these studies don't necessarily reflect how our memories work in everyday life. The advantage of carrying out studies within labs is that you can control the extraneous variables very easily. Because it's a controlled environment, you have complete control over the situation. You can control any of the factors which you think might have an impact on your results. The downside is that participants know they're taking part in a study, which influences their general behaviour. So it may be that their behaviour isn't natural. It may be that the behaviour you're recording isn't how people would actually act or respond in everyday life. The second type of experiment that we use is a field experiment. Now, when people hear the word field, they tend to think that it means the experiment has to be carried out of doors, maybe even away from a city. That's not what we mean when we say field. What we mean is just that it's in a natural environment. So a natural environment could be an office, it could be a school, it could be out in a shopping centre, anywhere where people are just going about their daily lives as they would do normally. Now, usually the tasks given in field experiments are much more natural. So, for example, if we were studying somebody's memory in a lab experiment, we might ask them to remember a list of meaningless words or a list of trigrams. In a field experiment, we would ask them to remember something which their everyday life would require that they remember anyway. So, for example, we could use a GCSE student and we could ask them to remember or recall something that is relevant to one of their GCSE courses. So it's something which they would have to do anyway. Now, the downside of this, or of conducting an experiment in the field, is that extraneous variables are much more difficult to control. So because we're out of that controlled environment, things can happen to participants throughout the course of the study which we have no knowledge of and no control over, and those things can influence the results that we collect. However, a positive is that very often participants aren't necessarily aware that they're taking part in the study. Therefore, their behaviour is more likely to be natural. The third type of experiment that we use within psychology is called a natural experiment. And in some ways it seems like it's quite similar to a field experiment. But there is one key difference, and that's to do with how the IV changes. So in a field experiment, the researcher will still actively manipulate the independent variable. So if we were looking at the impact maybe of two different teaching methods on how well students learn maths, we might take two different maths classes and use the two different methods and then give them both an assessment at the end to see which of those two methods has had the greatest impact. Now, that would be a field experiment because the psychologist or the researcher has decided which group is going to have which of the two interventions. This isn't always practically possible. One example of this is daycare. So imagine we wanted to see the impact of daycare on aggression levels in children. Now, we can't go to parents and say to them, you have to send your child to daycare or you can't send your child to daycare. It's not ethical and it's not practical to try and set up a study in that way. So instead we'd use a natural experiment, which is where the IV does change, but it's not the researcher who changes it. So in my example, the parents would naturally decide whether they want to send their children to daycare or not, and then the researcher would approach parents from each of those two groups and ask them if they're willing to take part in the study. So the dependent variable could still be measured in the lab. So in our example, the researcher might get those children into the lab and measure their aggression levels, or they may use questionnaires from parents or from teachers to find out what their aggression levels are like. And it's also very, very difficult to control extraneous variables. Now, because we might be measuring behaviour in a lab, it can be that the behaviour is not natural because the participants, again, may know that they're being studied. The final type of experiment that we use within psychology is a quasi experiment. And the word quasi actually means fake, and that's because a quasi experiment isn't actually a real experiment. And the reason for this is because there isn't actually an active manipulation of an IV. So a quasi experiment is when the IV does exist, but it's not changed by anyone. So in a lab and a field experiment, the researcher was changing the IV. In a natural experiment, the IV is changed by somebody else. In a quasi-experiment, the IV is simply a difference that already exists. For example, gender. So if you wanted to look at gender differences between males and females, you can't assign people to a particular group or change their gender for the sake of an experiment. So you just have to pick on that difference which already exists naturally. So as with a natural experiment, the dependent variable may still be measured in a lab, and as with a natural experiment, it's very difficult to control extraneous variables, and behaviour may not be natural if participants know they're being studied. So you can have a read of the pre-reading notes to get a little bit more detail on these 4 types of experiment, but before you come into your lesson, make sure that you can explain the difference between the 4 types of experiments. You can explain how the type of experiment might affect the behaviour of the participants and therefore how accurate your results may be. And thinking about the experiments we've looked at in the course so far, can you determine whether they are lab, field, natural or indeed quasi experiments?